Hi, I'm Jacob. I really like video games, so I tend to pay attention to the news and discourse surrounding the subject. And if there's one subject that I see cause a lot of totally respectful discussion, it's the topic of representation and diversity in games. Now, full disclosure, I am a white dude, so maybe not the best voice to speak on it, but it's a voice nonetheless. I still think it's an important topic within a hobby that's really special to me, so let's talk about it. If you go scrolling in various gaming circles on the internet, especially when new games are announced, you'll hear lots of complaints. But one that always rises to the surface is the concept of politics in video games and the dreaded SJWs. You'll typically see discourse about this when a game is announced featuring a character that is gay, or a woman, or black, or anything that isn't a straight white dude. It makes me upset when people take the mere existence of a diverse character as political or pushing an agenda, as they make it seem as if people like them in the real world don't exist, or don't matter, or don't deserve to be as well represented as white people are. If it isn't clear yet, I do think representation is important. If you claim that you don't need to share something in common with a character to appreciate them, then that's great. And for the most part, most people do actually feel that way. But when you do share something unique with a character in media, that can give you a whole new appreciation for the character, even if it's something that doesn't directly affect the story. The problem is, in most media as a whole, there isn't very diverse representation. This goes for video games, as for a very long time they've primarily been targeted towards young white boys. While we've gotten more diverse representation in the past decade, you'd be hard-pressed to find a ton of strong, diverse characters when looking at the entire history of gaming as a whole. Fantasy games, and the genre in general, are sometimes the worst offenders, as these games are typically overwhelmingly white. Now, I've heard the argument that a lot of fantasy is based on Europe, and Europe is largely white, but, I mean, come on, it's fantasy. Take The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, for example. This is an example of a game in which you create your own character, so hypothetically, if you want your character to look like you, then that should be possible. However, if we look at the character creator, you can see that if we take out the lizard people, elves, cat people, and orcs, we have 4 human races: the Breton, Nord, Imperial, and Redguard. Of these 4, only the Redguard is black. Now, to be fair, the other 3 do have skin tones to make them appear black, but something interesting I found when revisiting the creator was that the Redguards have additional hairstyles, ones that are more traditionally African. Now, on one side, this is good, as African hairstyles are often sorely lacking in games in which you make your character. However, if we look at the other 3 human races, they do not have access to these styles. Although you can technically change these 3 to be black, it's clear that they're intended to be white. So, all in all, if you're a black person looking to play Skyrim, and you want your character to look like you and accurately represent you, you're kinda stuck with the Redguards. Enjoy your adrenaline rush ability and poison resistance! Now, if you don't care to have your character look like you necessarily, and you're perfectly happy being a lizard person or an elf, that's great! But it's the lack of options that I'm trying to point out here. Now, as a white dude, it's not exactly hard to find a piece of media that represents me in some way. But from my limited experience, I'd like to give you a personal example from a time I experienced an admittedly smaller and trivial form of representation. I really like The Legend of Zelda. Ever since I was a kid, I loved the series, even though I always sucked at dungeons and Never really played them all the way through until I was older. Instead, I'd watch my dad or my brother play them, and once I discovered YouTube, there was no end to Zelda content I could consume. Then, at some point, I learned a fun fact about the pointy-eared green man who I've seen running all over Hyrule. Most incarnations of Link are left-handed. How cool is that? Me and this epic tunic-wearing hero had something unique in common. From his debut game on the NES, you can even see the sword come from his left side on his sprite. Just like me, if you handed Link some modern-day ergonomic scissors, he'd struggle to cut things comfortably. Just like me, if he was sitting in math class and using a pencil, he'd lift his hand up and it'd be all smudged up. Just like me, if Link was going to school in the 1920s, he'd be beaten with a ruler by a nun with anger issues until he became right-handed. Okay, maybe that's a bit overdramatic, but you get my point. And Link's incarnations remained left-handed from Zelda 2, A Link to the Past, into the 3D era with Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess. And all was good for the little left-handed Zelda fan. That was until the Wii. Everyone knows about the Wii. Everyone had a Wii. Motion controls were the big thing for this console, and because of that, you had to use one of these babies. And you held it in your right hand, since, well, most of the population is right-handed. Now, I mentioned Twilight Princess. This is one of my favorites, because I have fond memories of watching my brother play it when I was younger. It was originally a GameCube game, and Link was a lefty, as usual. However, when they decided to port it over to the Wii, they made a heinous decision. They would implement motion controls. And since most people were going to be swinging the Wiimote with the right hand, it only made sense to make Link a righty. Now, did this move make sense? Sure. Did it make sense for Link to be a righty in the next game, Skyward Sword, which uses one-to-one motion? Totally. Am I still salty that Link is right-handed in Breath of the Wild despite there being no motion controls for the sword combat? Absolutely! But I think this is a good, albeit relatively inconsequential, example of how even something as simple as a dominant hand can make you feel that much more connected to a character. A little kid had something in common with a big, strong hero. Thing is, this goes tenfold when it comes to things like race or gender. Besides the brief time that lefties were thought of as devil children, we aren't discriminated against. And the only lasting societal effects from right-hand dominance is uncomfortable scissors. However, people in minority groups that have been and are still being affected negatively need these stories. If I can feel a better connection with a character because of their dominant hand, I can only imagine how someone from the LGBT might feel when they see a strong character like Ellie from The Last of Us, whose lesbian relationship is shown in a realistic way in Part 2. Or how a young person of color might feel seeing Miles Morales, a half-black, half-Puerto Rican Spider-Man, swinging around New York in both animation and video games. And representation can go beyond just sexuality or race. Other underrepresented things like mental health problems can also be powerful for people who might suffer from them. Take Celeste, for example, which features Madeline, someone who suffers from intense anxiety and panic attacks. She sets off to climb a mountain just to prove to herself that she can. However, as she climbs, she eventually meets a reflection of herself, who embodies her anxiety and self-doubts. Her other self taunts and attacks her through the game, and eventually leads to this sequence, which I find very powerful. Now, in a DLC that was added to the game after release, we see Madeline in her room, talking to her friend that she met on the mountain. Now, this still image caused quite the outrage among the gamers. I'll give you a second to figure it out. Yep, you guessed it. If you look real close at her desk, you'll see both a pride flag and a trans flag, implying that Madeline herself is trans, or at least part of the LGBTQ in some way. But looking at the game and its themes as a whole, it makes sense. While I can relate to Madeline on a base level, as I've experienced anxiety at times, the fact that this strong, possibly trans character experienced it and still managed to reach her goal is incredibly powerful. The anxiety and other mental pain that many in that group go through can be awful, and having that represented in a very widely successful game can really help people. Now, again, if you personally don't care if you're represented, that's fine. If you feel like you can personally relate to a character no matter who they are, that's great. My argument here is that having these things in games can affect people in a positive way, even if it doesn't affect you. And no, capital G gamers, having a female protagonist does not negatively affect you. You can call it pandering, and I'm sure there's cases where that may be true, but even if it is, I really don't see the big deal. If it helps someone connect with a character or can tell an interesting story, I think that's what matters. Not necessarily the intentions or agenda of the company, but how it actually affects people. Even if something doesn't represent you, it can serve as a way to expose you to people or ideas that you might not encounter in your everyday life. It humanizes people. It gives them more than one story to represent them. As writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie brilliantly puts it,
what this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them, and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamaralaye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar.
I highly recommend watching the full video that I'll link in the description. Try to think about how it relates to any media you consume, whether it's books, movies, or games. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you for watching. I made this for a college class, but I think I'll make it public and see what happens. Feel free to leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. Until next time.